Welcome back, everybody, to... Hi, sorry for disturbing you. Samwise is here with me today. He's been a little bit needy, so figured I would film somewhere where he can feel close. I have been meaning to do on this channel for a while a reading vlog. And one of the goals that I have this year is to get back into reading classics more frequently. Oh, bye. I guess I was talking too loud for him. Anyway, I know I mentioned before on this channel that my major in my undergrad program was English literature, and then I moved on to my master's in creative writing. So I do have a really heavy background in reading and studying and taking in and picking apart classic literature, but it's something that I've really fallen away from over the last couple of years. I think I was so immersed in it as a student and so immersed in it as a teacher, and I really do love a lot of classic literature. It is one of my favorite things to read, and it just isn't something I've really been prioritizing for the past couple years since I left my teaching job and since I went and got my second degree. Hi again. And I want to be better about that this year because I miss reading the classics, and I've got a few that I've meant to read forever and I haven't, and I feel a little bit like I don't deserve my English degree because they're such popular classics that I haven't actually tackled. There's just so many that I still need to read. So to kick this off, I am picking one of the classics that's been on my list for a long time and one that I added to my list for this year specifically, and I'm going to pair it with a reading vlog and take you along on the journey and just kind of give my thoughts throughout, record my reactions and my thoughts as I'm reading, and then try to do a sort of reflection at the end and just give my overall thoughts. But the first classic I am reading this year, and the first reading vlog, besides readathons of course, but like dedicated to a single book that I am doing, is for George Orwell's 1984. Now a lot of people are surprised I haven't read this because, again, English major with the classic lit background, but I have been meaning to read this forever because obviously it is a hallmark in literary dystopian fiction, and specifically starting with this one because another goal of mine is to be better about reading books that are recommended to me in a more timely manner. So something that I'm not great about is reading books that are recommended to me quickly. I joke that it takes me 3 to 5 business years to get back to you on the book that you recommended to me. And a lot of that is that, for one thing, my reading time is so special to me. I often get a little selfish with it and I just read what I want to read. And I don't always necessarily feel super inclined to read the things that are recommended to me. I'm interested, but it's not necessarily top of the priority list. But I have friends who like really want me to read things and I just don't get around to it forever, and it makes me feel like a bad friend because, you know, when I recommend books to people, I'm so excited to recommend it and I can't wait to hear their thoughts and I want to talk to them about it. So in personal reflections, I've realized I would like to be better about that. I have a friend from college who really, really loves this book, and obviously, again, being a literature student or former literature student, it's one that I've wanted to read anyway, but specifically, hi! Stealing the show again, as he does. About a year ago, a friend of mine listened to the dramatized audiobook of 1984, and she absolutely loved it and was just in shambles over it and begged me to get around to reading it. And because it's one that I've wanted to tackle anyway, I told her, you know, of course I'll listen to the dramatized version, but I'm going to read the book first. So it's taken me about a year, but that's so much quicker than it usually is for me, so I promise I'm working on it. It was about time that I got back into some classic lit and started to tackle my list of classic literature that I really want to get to. Obviously, I don't think I will ever get to all the ones that I should read because there's so many and it's such a wide scope of things that I could be reading. But yeah, this was near the top of the list of classic literature that I want to tackle. So we're gonna go ahead and get right into it. Probably won't start it today because it's almost dinner and we have dinner plans. It's the weekend, so the evening will just get away from me. But I am planning to prioritize this over the next couple weeks or so, hopefully get through it pretty quickly. Something else too that I want to get back to doing, like just to include in this introduction, is that I used to annotate my books, especially when I was a student. I still do it a little bit now, but I'm a little bit pickier about how I do it. Often my more modern fiction, I don't touch. I don't do that. It feels sacrilegious to me. I don't know why. But all my classic lit books and all the books that I had to read for school are just like covered in notes and tabs, and a lot of my nonfiction books are highlighted and underlined, and there's notes in the margins, and I have notes on the side about what I've been reading. So I want to get back to doing that as well. Maybe not with everything that I read, because there is still a part of me that doesn't like to mark up my books, but my classic books that require a little bit more dissecting, I'd like to be better and more intentional about actually taking my time and sitting down and doing annotations. That's something else that I noticed last year, is that I was rushing through books so quickly, I had a harder time gathering my thoughts on them. So going back to my roots with classic literature, that forces me to slow down a little bit, and annotating it, because that forces me to actually sit and read and hold a pencil and take notes as I'm going. I think that'll be good for the reading goals that I'm trying to set for myself, and it will help the reading experience overall. So yeah, excited to get into it. George Orwell's 1984. Here we go. halfway through. Got just under 130 pages or so to go. So I figured I should probably check in at this point with some of my thoughts. As you can see, it looks like I have many, but I'm struggling to figure out at this point in the story what to say about it. For one thing, something that I will say is that I didn't know what to expect going into this. I knew this was a classic dystopian novel, and I was expecting it to be tragic and weird and to have a lot of political commentary. And while there is very clearly political commentary, it is also very, very much about groupthink, I think, which I know is a political idea. But I'm surprised so far by the moral discussion that Orwell is weaving into the political discussion about groupthink, about this idea of learning to think for yourself, and how, especially with the character of Julia, even though she is rebellious and she is against the party as much as he is, the fact that she only thinks about it in reference to her own desires and the way that she wants to live her life and doesn't really think about overall her grand ideologies as long as it doesn't affect her. I think it's just really interesting seeing that kind of commentary within the realm of politics. I think it feels especially relevant right now, and that's a discussion I've had recently. And not that I know a great deal about politics, I will be so honest, I don't. I try to pay attention as much as I can, and a lot of it just goes over my head, but I'm trying to be better about engaging in that discourse and understanding what I believe and why I believe it, and I think there's a lot of that here. It's the kind of discussions I've had in my faith journey, but not so much in my political journey, and it's been interesting to me to see the way they tend to overlap, and that could be a whole other discussion about faith and politics and how they should or shouldn't go hand in hand. I know that would be an interesting discussion to have, but it's not the one I necessarily want to have here. But yeah, it's just been really interesting kind of looking at all of this from a bird's eye view and picking apart the way this society works and picking apart even characters who are trying to rebel against the party, how even their message and their ideals are a little bit narrow in their scope and a bit small-minded and a bit selfish. It feels like nobody can win, and it's a little bit bleak, I won't lie. There's been a few points where it's just, I've had to stop and literally write the words, this is just so sad, or this is so bleak, or this is so grim. And obviously that's the point. That's what Orwell is trying to accomplish. But yeah, it's been really interesting so far. Something else I'm really struck by is his descriptive language. It's a very approachable, very easily readable book, but I've noticed in particular, I'm noticing a pattern of him using smell and sound a lot in his descriptors. And I don't know if that's something I should be paying attention to, but it's something I notice again and again, is that when he wants to get, or what it seems to be is that when he wants to get a visceral reaction out of the reader, he really leans into the sense of smell or the sense of sound. And sometimes those overlap as well. But yeah, it's been really interesting. I really don't know what to expect from the rest of the story. I'm expecting tragedy. I'm expecting that much for sure, because he also continually talks about death. I think that was something else that surprised me so far, as I thought this was going to be a lot about politics, and it is, but it's also very much about death and his fear of it and the way that this society speaks about death and approaches it. And yeah, and the way it is used to dehumanize or belittle other humans. I don't know. I think I need to gather my thoughts more completely at the end. But right now, that is what I'm struck by. The fact that it is so much more about death than politics than I previously anticipated, that his descriptive language is really visceral and very well done. There's been so many lines I've had to stop and underline because it just, I don't want to say takes my breath away, because it's not nice. It's not nice to read, but it definitely stops me in my tracks because it just hits you like a freight train, the way he describes things. Let me see if I can find an example. I'm wasting camera time here, but anyway. Here's a really just quick example, and nothing that had any deeper significance as far as I can tell. But this sentence, he pushed open the door and a hideous, cheesy smell of sour beer hit him in the face. That is such a visceral description, and so much of his description is like that. So it's something I've been really impressed by, for one thing, but also it's just making the whole thing feel so, I don't want to say so real, because I recognize that a lot of it is very exaggerated for the effect of the commentary that he's trying to make, but it engrosses me in the world in a way that makes me feel uncomfortable and worried, which I know is the point. So he hit the nail on the head. There's a reason it's a classic. But yeah, those are my kind of all over the place rambling thoughts so far. I'm going to go ahead and, how much time do I have? I'm going to read for the next 30 or 40 minutes, get as much done today as I can. can. And yeah, hoping to wrap this up in the next few days or so, and then I will probably need a little bit to gather my thoughts, because again, this commentary is, I don't want to say all over the place because it's not. It is all connected, but I think there are a lot of common threads that he's weaving, and I'm waiting to see how it all wraps up in the end to really be able to digest what it is that he's getting at. And I think I have an idea generally of the point that he's trying to guide the reader towards, but it's, yeah, more thoughts to come. I'm gonna have to chew on this for a while, I think. So anyway, I'm gonna go ahead and keep reading. Here we go. Thoughts briefly that I was not able to articulate earlier. The first thing is with Orwell's description, what I really think I wanted to say about it overall is that he really captures the feeling of dread so well. His narrative voice and his visceral descriptive language all evoke this constant sense of dread, and you feel it so deeply as you're reading. So that, I think, is the main comment I was trying to get at earlier with his descriptive language, is that it's just so dreadful in a way that makes it so his message gets across very clearly. And then the other thing I think that I was trying to pinpoint is that so much of this book is about the worship of ideology without really thinking more deeply about what that ideology entails. And so it's a really interesting discussion that's going on, but again, I'm still getting into the meat of it and still trying to pick apart exactly what we're getting at with that idea. But that is the phrase that came to mind as I was reading and as I continued in the story, is so much the commentary is about worship of ideology over thinking about what your ideology actually means, if that makes sense. Anyway, I only managed about maybe 40 pages today. Not a ton, I'm about there. But I'm in the middle of the super long, like, political treatise that reads like a history textbook, and it's been like 20 pages of that. There was maybe 2 pages of actual narrative break, and now we're back to reading the political treatise, and so my brain is just fried because there's like 20 more pages of it. And it took me probably close to an hour to read that little bit. So I'm gonna be done for today and return to it soon. I have officially hit page 200 of 291, so I am in the last 100 pages and should hopefully finish this within the next week or so. Hopefully less. Anyway, chat soon. Been reading this book that is not even 300 pages long for too long now. So I'm determined to finish it today, if I can. I have about an hour and a half, about 70 pages left. So yeah, we're gonna try, because I'm ready to wrap it up and gather my thoughts. So here we go. As you can see, I tabbed a lot of things, and I have somehow both not much to say and also a lot to say. So I have my notes also to guide me through what I will, inevitably end up just rambling about, because that's what I do. Also, please excuse the background panting noise. Samwise is here. You can't see him, but he's here by my chair. And we just ran around a bunch, so he is breathing so heavy and so loud. My initial thoughts on 1984. I feel very, very similarly to this book as I did to The Great Gatsby. And let me explain why, because obviously they are two very different books. But as a former literature student, as someone who taught literature, as someone whose life and career has often been within the sphere of literary fiction, I think this is a brilliant book, and I like what it's doing. As just a normal reader, I didn't love it. I liked it. It was fine. I didn't love it. So objectively, I think it's excellent. Subjectively, it's just not really my thing. That said, there are some things in this book that have really stuck with me after finishing it, and I think I do have more positive than negative to say. So I'm going to start with things that didn't really work for me, that didn't really land, and then things that really did work for me, and wrap it up from there. So beginning with things that didn't work for me. Firstly, this book is just a bummer. And it's supposed to be, but tragedies and books that are just kind of sad, and that's the main gist of it, don't really jive with me. And I know that my own personal worldview influences that opinion that I have, but historically, cautionary tales that don't necessarily provide much hope as to how to address the caution that is within just aren't really my thing, and they always kind of leave me feeling like I want more from the story. So there's a small piece of me that, even though I know this was wrapped up well, there's the subjective part of me in my heart that kind of just made me go like, meh. And upon further reflection, I realized that there are glimmers of hope throughout this book, and reading other opinions on this book as a whole from people who are definitely more educated and smarter than me has made me realize that there are glimpses of hope within this, that it isn't just entirely cautionary. But my main takeaway after I finished was just like, oh, it's one of those again. So, and that's just never really my thing. So that was difficult for me. Also, the other main thing is I'm just not politically savvy, and I never have been. And so much of this book is political and social commentary. And while I can get the gist of it, and I can interact with that because I can see the grander message and worldview that he's approaching and trying to comment upon, there's not as much for me to engage with, just because that's not really something I deeply understand. And so I don't necessarily have a lot to say about this book on that front, because I recognize I'm rather uneducated on those things, and it's something I'd like to be better about, which I'm going to get into in a second, but it's just, yeah, that's not really my thing, and it never has been. So things like the 40 pages of political manifesto, literally, let me show you in the book how much book it actually took up, because woof, okay, it's not that long, but this much of the book, you see that? You see these? That much of it was literally just like a political textbook. That was not fun to read. It probably took me 2 hours just to read that portion, because it was just so, annoying. It was annoying to read, frankly. And I know that's so much the point of it, and a lot of it is just my own lack of understanding, but that made it difficult for me to really enjoy personally as a reader. Again, objectively, as someone who consistently thinks of herself as a student, even as I'm not a student, I like to study. I like to approach texts like this with a student's mindset, with the idea of coming into it as a literary classic and meeting it where it's at. Just as a reader, that was just hard for me to engage with. And again, that's not necessarily an objective critique of the book. It is my own lack of understanding and savvy on those things. But because of that, I had a harder time engaging with large sections of this book. I could understand the grander picture he was trying to get you to see, but it was still difficult for me to really get the minutia of that and to fully appreciate what he was doing. So more lack on my part than on the part of Orwell's writing, but still, that it just took it out of me. It was exhausting to read. And in those moments where we just went into, even beyond that like 40-page stretch, there were other sections where we were just explaining the politics of the world and explaining how this works, and it was so info heavy that it took a lot out of me to read. I liked it, but it was one of those things where I couldn't just like pick it up for 20 minutes. I had to give myself a dedicated chunk of time to reading this book so that I could slow down, really absorb what was happening, take notes, tab things as I saw fit. It just took time, and it took a lot of mental energy. And while I'm willing to put in mental energy as a reader, it took a little more effort for me than usual with this one. But things that did work for me, and I have a lot more positive to say than negative here. The first thing is Orwell's writing. So I mentioned this already, but he just has such incredible descriptive language. And I'm gonna read a couple of examples just to give you an idea, if you haven't read the book, of what I mean, and if you have, to remind you of what I'm talking about. So page 54 is the reference I have here. Yes, so talking about some guy. I think it might be Goldstein that he's talking about here. But anyway, he says, as he watched the eyeless face with the jaw moving rapidly up and down, Winston had a curious feeling that this was not a real human being, but some kind of dummy. It was not the man's brain that was speaking, it was his larynx. And that I wrote was such an eerie description, and I loved it because that's just so, within a couple of sentences, he captures such an unsettling picture, and he does this over and over and over again. Another example, page 74, talking about, Winston is just, he's thinking about the party and how they're trying to convince everyone that everything is good when it's not. And he says, he seemed to see a vision of London, vast and ruinous, city of a million dustbins, and mixed up with it was a picture of Mrs. Parsons, a woman with lined face and wispy hair fiddling helplessly with a blocked wastepipe. Taking the grand scope of London and then narrowing it down to this one person that he knows and capturing in those two images how awful things really are. That's brilliant. That's brilliant writing. And again, that's why I don't necessarily want to critique the book for my own lack of personal enjoyment, because again, with the background that I have, I think that writing is incredible. That is so striking and such a quick image, and he just does the job so well with that. And while there were some sections that I, of course, like I've said, that I struggled with, it was overall a pretty accessible read. I wasn't struggling with the language of it. It wasn't something where I had to take my time with it because of a lack of being able to understand what was going on. It was more my own lack of knowledge about this particular subject, and not so much the writing itself feeling old or difficult to read, if that makes sense. So I did appreciate that it was a pretty accessible read, even with the sections that I struggled to really comprehend or that took me longer to really digest. Second thing, the overall message about humanity. And I think this was my main takeaway, is that even though this is meant to be a grander political social commentary, what I took away from it was the beauty and endurance of humanity despite everything. So for example, on page 124 and 219, he mentions the bird singing and the washerwoman singing a lot. And just the way he ties those two images together, continually repeats them to really hammer this point home. So speaking about the birds, he says, "For whom, for what was that bird singing? No mate, no rival was watching it. What made it sit at the edge of the lonely wood and pour its music into nothingness?" And then later, when he's talking about the washerwoman, who we've commented on so many times at this point. So yeah, he's watching the washerwoman out of the window from the room that he and Julia share. And he says, as he looked at the woman in her characteristic attitude, her thick arms reaching up for the line, her powerful mare-like buttocks protruded, it struck him for the first time that she was beautiful. It had never before occurred to him that the body of a woman of 50, blown up to the monstrous dimensions by childbearing, then hardened, roughened by work till it was coarse in the grain like an overripe turnip, could be beautiful. But it was so, and after all, he thought, why not? The solid, contourless body like a block of granite, and the rasping red skin bore the same relation to the body of a girl as the rose hip to the rose. Why should the fruit be held inferior to the flower? That's lovely, for one thing. That's a lovely description. But looking at these two pictures of the world as it should be, the bird singing, the washerwoman singing, and just this celebration of that simplicity, it reminded me a lot of Tolkien's messaging in The Lord of the Rings, of the beauty of a simple life. One of my favorite quotes of all time from literature is, "It is no bad thing to celebrate a simple life," from Lord of the Rings. It's this very similar idea that even though this book is so hopeless and grim and bleak, the underlying message that isn't really where we end the story but is woven throughout is this idea that it is the simple people doing simple acts of kindness, doing simple human things that will change and save the world in the end. And that message, in whatever medium it is captured, in whichever way it is told, is a message that always resonates with me. So even though that wasn't necessarily the main point of this book, the fact that it was present and the fact that it was woven throughout in those little details, I really loved and appreciated about this one. And furthermore, within that, I loved the way that he personified old objects. So the quote I have here is from page 97, when he rents the room for the first time, or he's looking at the room for the first time, one of those. But he says, "It was a wild, impossible notion to be abandoned as soon as thought of, but the room had awakened in him a sort of nostalgia, a sort of ancestral memory." I love that line. "It seemed to him that he knew exactly what it felt like to sit in a room like this, in an armchair beside an open fire with your feet in the fender and a kettle on the hob. And then this is the part I underline, utterly alone, utterly secure, with nobody watching you, no voice pursuing you, no sound except the singing of the kettle and the friendly ticking of the clock." The singing of the kettle and the friendly ticking of the clock, those were the things that stood out to me, because he personifies old inanimate objects like this in a way to show humanity's past. And in a way, I think he's doing this over and over again to showcase the way old things capture what it means to be human, and how in this world, the fact that we've erased all memory, we've erased history, we are rewriting history as it happens, and not in a good way. I wrote here, "These objects speak to that ancestral history Winston spoke of, a time when humans were more human women and their objectified lives reflected that. I think that's beautiful too. So again, just the celebration of humanity that is present in this book, even though it is not necessarily the focal point of the story, that is the glimmers of hope that I see later upon reflection that I had a harder time seeing while I was actually reading it, that I do think is worthwhile in the story, and that for me was the biggest takeaway and the biggest thing that I enjoyed overall about the story. And then my last thought with that here about humanity, I'm really intrigued by the idea of death being so present throughout, especially connected to thinking. I need to examine that more in depth and kind of gather my thoughts on that a bit more, but I'm really fascinated by that idea of to think is to be alive, to be able to think is the final freedom, is the final act of rebellion that you can give, and this constant idea of we're already dead and we're just corpses waiting to be dragged back to the grave. The fact that he seems to be hitting on this idea pretty consistently that to progress is to die in some way. Yeah, I don't know, but the discussion of death and humanity being so deeply intertwined in this book is something I'd like to unpack more. I don't think I fully understand the exact point I'm trying to say with that, but I did notice it and I did think it was fascinating that that was such a focal point of the story. The idea of being essentially the walking dead because you no longer have freedom, you no longer have your own voice, you can't even think freely anymore, and how thoughts and language and all of these things being put to death also is the death of the person, if that makes sense. I think that's maybe the point that I'm trying to get to, but yeah, fascinated by that as well. And then finally, it did make me uncomfortable in the right ways. So with this, again, I'm not necessarily the best person to be discussing the societal messages overall in this because it's something that I'm not as well versed in. It's something that I need to be more educated on. It was just a helpful and kind of terrifying but good reminder about the dangers of groupthink. Those are discussions I've been having more and more lately with my friends and with my husband, just the idea, especially considering social media propaganda and virtue signaling and just this idea of learning how to think for yourself and not just going with the crowd because that's what the crowd is saying. And this is something that comes up in my own faith a lot as well, being able to talk about what you believe and why, and how if you can't identify those things, if you just believe it because you were told to, then your faith is in danger and that you need to examine it more closely. It was a good reminder to always be aware of that pitfall, that the answer to what I believe and why should always be evolving to some degree, because that means I'm actually engaging in the discourse that matters as far as my worldview and belief systems go. Yeah, I wrote here, like, within my faith, many are Christian in title but not in practice, and I try to be very aware of my answers here so I don't just adopt a name and not a lifestyle, which is a very easy thing to do as an American. So that's a whole other discussion. The line that struck me with this and what made me really sit back and go like, oh man, I need to think about that a little bit more. Page 156, I have it here. He and Julia are talking and he insults her terribly, and anyway, I could talk about that too. But he says, talking to her, he realized how easy it was to present an appearance of orthodoxy while having no grasp whatsoever of what orthodoxy meant. And that really hit me because there were a lot of times characters that kind of blindly followed or thought they had all the facts or thought they had a strong opinion, but it was really very self-centered and not considering the world at large or other factors. It made me think of the way that I approach the things that I'm learning and how self-centered my thought processes can be and how often I don't pay attention to grander things because they don't affect me. And that unsettled me, and in a way where it makes me want to be more aware and compassionate to the greater world around me. And I like to believe that I am to an extent, and a lot of that too comes from just being overloaded by information and not physically having enough in me to be able to care about every single piece of information that comes my way, which again is another discussion. But it was just a very unsettling challenge to the way that I approach the world at large, and needing to be curious and to really digest the information that I am being given rather than just kind of letting it gloss over me and only focusing on what pertains to me. So yeah, that was a helpful reminder because it's something that I know I'm not very good at, and that is a pitfall that I often fall into. So that one kind of startled me into remembering that I need to do that. Yeah, I said the message of this book does feel especially relevant even now, and it served as a sobering reminder to pay attention. And on that note, quote that just kind of made me chuckle because it's true. It says, "The best books he perceived are those that tell you what you already know." And that was one of my critiques about this book at the beginning, was it kind of felt like nothing new. I recognize this is one of the first books to do dystopian literature in this way, but because it is older and I grew up in the age of YA dystopia kind of coming to a head with the Hunger Games and Divergent, like that was the era that I grew up in, it didn't necessarily feel like anything new to me, but that reminder of a lot of times literature is there to remind us of things that we need to be aware of, things that we are already aware of, but to put to words the things that we should be paying attention to. So yeah, that quote just made me laugh, and again, kind of served as the overall challenge that it set to me of remembering to pay attention and to think for myself and to know what I believe and why, and to be addressing that question consistently so that I don't fall into the pitfall of groupthink or just believing something because I am told I should. I didn't love this book, but I did like it, and I think overall what I'm feeling is that I was impressed and challenged by it, and I'm glad to have finally read it, and it's opened up a lot of personal discussion for me that's been interesting. And the more I reflect on this, the more I'm realizing that my appreciation for having read it is coming more from my ability to discuss the ideas within, and not necessarily because I enjoyed the story itself, which also means the book did its job. That's the point, is to make you talk about these things. And I don't know that Orwell was setting out to create like the best literary characters of all time. They're very caricature-y, and it's on purpose. And again, those books just don't tend to land with me very well, but I do appreciate that it is bringing up these discussions for me, even if I'm not necessarily thinking about the story. I don't know that I'm going to think about the characters, the plot, the world very much at all, but the ideas within are very haunting, and they do linger. The book has accomplished what it was meant to. It's just not my cup of tea necessarily, but again, it's this weird balance I have to hold with like recognizing the story itself, for me, but the ideas within challenging and good. But yeah, I think those are my thoughts overall. I'm kind of divided on it because clearly I had a lot of positive things to say, but am I going to be like raving from the rooftops about how much I loved this book? Not necessarily. I don't think I will. But yeah, if you've read this book, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts. What was your perception of it? And because this is an area of education that I am not necessarily well versed in, that is hard for me to understand. Again, I'm not very politically, socially savvy in that way. I'd like to believe I got the basics, but as far as engaging in further discourse, those kinds of things, those grander ideas are harder for me to access. They just always have been. I try, but a lot of it goes over my head, or I have to pick through the jargon so closely that I don't really get the picture overall. But yeah, from someone who maybe understands those things better, I'm curious to hear your thoughts, and I'm curious to hear if there's anything I said that you would like to expand upon, because I'm really curious about what's happening in this book and in the time period that this book was written, because I recognize it was also in response to what was happening politically at the time for Orwell. So yeah, what are your thoughts? Have you read it, and what did you think? Because I would like to talk about it in deeper discussions and not just the surface of what I took away from it. So yeah, overall, I appreciated the common thread of discussing human nature and the simplicity of it, and how that's significant and important and something we shouldn't ignore. The overall political, social message didn't necessarily land with me, but not because it's not significant or well done, but because it's just not really my thing. But yeah, I think that's all I have to say on this one. Really glad to have read it. Oh, also, I ended up giving it, no, my light died. This always happens. I ended up giving it 4 stars. Again, I'm really, really impressed by it objectively, subjectively, just not necessarily my thing, but that's fine. So 4 stars for me for this one. But yeah, be really curious to hear the thoughts of others who have read this one, because there's definitely more there that I'm not seeing or not understanding, or that I haven't fully digested or picked apart in my own thoughts yet. So let's chat, please, because I'm curious to hear what other people have to say. Anyway, I think that is all for me for now. Not sure what comes next for me on the channel, but I'll be around, you know. In the meantime, you can also follow me on Instagram and Goodreads. I do have those links below. And if you like this video and would like to hear me chat more about the things that I'm reading and the things that I am writing, you can also hit the subscribe button below. Thank you so much for being here, as always. I appreciate each and every one of you for engaging in these conversations with me and being a part of what I do here. Hey, Samwise, you wanna come say hi? Well, you know what? I'll let him say hi to you in his own spot. He is there. Hi, Samwise. But yeah, until next time, happy reading, happy writing, and I will chat with you all soon.